Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to be taking a look at some pretty interesting developments in Indian naval defense.
Yeah.
We've got this article here from the Economic Times,
Hmm.
which, if you're not familiar, is kind of like the Indian equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, very reputable financial daily over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's all about how India is really stepping up its submarine capabilities and investing a lot of resources in that.
Yeah, they're making some pretty significant investments, and it's definitely something that's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
So let's dive right in, shall we?
let's do it.
Okay, so the big news here is that India's Ministry of Defense has just signed these contracts worth a pretty hefty sum, let me tell you.
Yeah, we're talking serious money here.
Yeah, like 2,867 crore rupees,
Wow.
which for those of us who aren't familiar with the Indian currency, that translates to over 345 million US dollars.
That's not chump change.
No, not at all. So clearly India is putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to their naval defense.
They are, and it's really a reflection of their broader strategic goals.
Yeah.
India is really looking to establish itself as a major player in the Indian Ocean, and these investments are a big part of that.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So the article here focuses specifically on the Kalvari-Class submarines. Can you tell us a little bit about those? What are they exactly?
Sure. So the Kalvari-Class submarines are diesel-electric attack submarines.
Mm-hmm.
They're really the backbone of India's submarine fleet, and they're designed for a variety of missions. Everything from anti-surface warfare to intelligence gathering.
So kind of like the silent hunters of the deep.
Exactly. They can operate very stealthily. They're equipped with some pretty sophisticated weaponry, and they're a real force to be reckoned with.
So these upgrades that we're talking about, I mean, what exactly are they getting? What's going to make these submarines even more formidable?
Well, one of the key upgrades is this thing called Air Independent Propulsion, or AIP.
Oh yeah, I saw that mentioned in the article, and I gotta admit, that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
It kind of is. It's pretty cutting edge stuff, but basically what AIP does is it allows non-nuclear submarines to stay submerged for much longer periods of time.
Okay, so instead of having to come up for air every few days like a conventional diesel-electric submarine, these Calvary-class subs with this AIP technology, they can just stay down there for like weeks on end.
Pretty much,
Yeah.
yeah. We're not talking months or anything, but definitely weeks at a time.
Wow, that's incredible. I mean, talk about stealth. I mean, that makes them so much harder to detect, right?
Absolutely gives them a huge tactical advantage.
Yep.
They can basically disappear beneath the waves, and nobody knows where they are until it's too late.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a game changer in any kind of naval conflict.
It is. It really changes the whole dynamic.
So this AIP technology is clearly a big deal, but the article also mentions something called electronic heavyweight torpedo or EHWT systems. What can you tell us about those?
Right. So these torpedoes are basically the big guns of underwater warfare. They're incredibly powerful. They have advanced guidance systems. They can travel long distances, and they pack a serious punch when they hit their target.
Okay, so we're not talking about your run-of-the-mill torpedoes here.
No, these are the real deal.
So not only are these submarines going to be super stealthy, but they're also going to be packing some serious firepower.
Exactly.
That's the idea.
That's pretty intimidating.
It is, and it's a clear sign that India is not messing around. They're taking their naval defense very seriously.
And I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, when you look at the geopolitical landscape in the Indian Ocean,
Right.
you've got China's growing presence.
Yeah.
They've got all these other players vying for influence. So India's got to do what it takes to protect its interest.
Absolutely. And they're doing it in a very strategic way.
Yeah.
They're focusing on technologies that will give them a real edge in this particular environment. Yeah, so it's not just about having more submarines, it's about having the right kind of submarines with the right kind of capabilities.
Exactly.
Well, this is fascinating stuff. I'm really glad we're diving into this today.
Me too.
But we're just scratching the surface here. There's a lot more to unpack, so we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into the implications of these developments for India and for the region as a whole.
Sounds good. Yeah, it's a pretty complex situation.
So it's like India is saying, hey, we're a force to be reckoned with, too.
Exactly. They're not going to be left behind in this naval arms race.
Right. And it's interesting that they've chosen to focus on these diesel electric subs with this AIP technology instead of, going the nuclear route like China has.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a reason for that?
Yeah, there are a couple of reasons, actually. First of all, India has a long-standing policy of no first use when it comes to nuclear weapons.
Right.
So they're not really interested in developing a nuclear submarine fleet. Secondly, these diesel-electric subs with AIP, they're actually incredibly well-suited for the Indian Ocean. It's a relatively shallow body of water compared to, say, the Pacific.
Mm-hmm.
And these subs, they're much quieter than nuclear subs, especially in those shallower waters.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about staying underwater longer. It's about being even more stealthy.
Exactly. It's about being a ghost in the water.
Yeah, a coast with some pretty big
Oh,
torpedoes.
that's right. Don't forget about those EHWTs.
No, definitely not.
Cool.
So, you mentioned earlier that these upgrades are going to raise some eyebrows in the region. What kind of reactions are we likely to see from other countries, like Pakistan, for example?
Yeah, well, Pakistan is definitely going to be watching this very closely. They've always had a tense relationship with India,
Right.
and they're likely to see these submarine advancements as a direct threat to their own security.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what about China? I mean, they're the big player in the region these days.
Oh, yeah. China's going to be paying attention, too. They've been steadily expanding their own naval presence in the Indian Ocean,
Mhm.
and they're not going to be happy to see India catching up.
So this could lead to like a bit of an arms race then.
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
As India beefs up its submarine fleet, other countries in the region might feel compelled to do the same,
Right.
just to keep up.
Yeah, so it's like a ripple effect.
And
One country makes a move and then everybody else has to react.
Exactly. It's a very dynamic situation.
So it's not just about India bolstering its own defenses, it's about the whole balance of power in the Indian Ocean.
That's right. It's a high-stakes game, and the stakes just got higher.
It's fascinating stuff, but it's also a little bit unsettling, when you think about all these submarines lurking beneath the waves.
I know what you mean. It's kind of like a whole other world down there, a
Mm.
world that most of us never really see.
Right, but it's a world that can have a huge impact on our lives. Think about all the trade that passes through the Indian Ocean, all the energy supplies.
No.
Any kind of disruption or conflict in that region would have major consequences for the global economy.
Absolutely. It's a vital waterway, and it's becoming increasingly important strategically.
So these submarine advancements, they're not just some abstract military development. They have real-world implications for all of us.
They do, and that's why it's so important to understand what's happening beneath the surface.
Well said, well said. So, we've talked a lot about the strategic implications of these submarine upgrades, but what about the human element? What's it like for the sailors who actually have to operate these vessels?
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
It takes a special kind of person to be a submariner.
Right.
I mean, you're talking about spending weeks or even months underwater in a confined space with limited communication with the outside world.
Yeah, that's got to be tough, both physically and mentally.
It is. It's a very demanding job, and it takes a lot of training and preparation.
And I imagine the psychological challenges are immense, just dealing with the isolation and the constant pressure.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a reason why submariners are considered to be some of the toughest and most resilient sailors in the world.
Yeah, they have to be. So, as we develop even more advanced submarines capable of staying submerged for even longer periods, are we going to need to rethink how we train and support our submariners?
That's a good question. And it's something that the navies of the world are already starting to grapple with.
Right.
As the technology evolves, the human factor becomes even more important.
So it's not just about building better submarines, it's about building better submariners.
Exactly.
Well, this is all very thought-provoking stuff. It's really made me think about the underwater world in a whole new light.
Me too.
So before we wrap up here, let's try to distill this all down for our listeners. What are the key takeaways from our deep dive today?
Okay, well, first of all, I think it's clear that India is serious about becoming a major naval power.
Right.
They're investing heavily in submarine technology, and they're not afraid to show it.
And that's sending a message to the rest of the world.
It's saying that India is a force to be reckoned with, and they're here to stay.
And it's creating a lot of uncertainty and tension in the region.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Nobody knows exactly how this is all going to play out, but it's definitely going to be interesting to watch.
Well said, well said. So on that note, I think we'll leave it there for today, but we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this story as it develops.
Me too. It's a fascinating one.
It's kind of like we've opened this Pandora's box and now all these submarines are going to come pouring out.
Yeah, it's a whole underwater arms race that's been brewing for a while now.
And we've talked a lot about like the strategic stuff, but I'm kind of curious about the human element,
Mm-hmm.
What's it like for the sailors who are actually on these submarines spending weeks or even months underwater. I mean,
Yeah.
that's got to be intense.
Oh, it is. It's an incredibly demanding environment. You're living in a very confined space
Right.
with a bunch of other people.
Yeah.
You're constantly under pressure, both literally and figuratively.
Yeah.
And you have very limited contact with the outside world. So it takes a very special kind of person to be a submariner.
Yeah, I bet. So it's like you got to be, super disciplined and mentally tough.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You got to be able to handle stress, got to be able to work well in a team,
Right.
got to be able to stay focused for long periods of time. It's not a job for everyone.
So, I mean, as we develop even more advanced submarines, capable of staying submerged for even longer,
Mm-hmm.
do we need to rethink, like, how we train our submariners?
That's a really good question. And it's something that navies around the world are starting to look at. The psychological challenges of prolonged submergence are significant.
Right.
And as we push the limits of technology, we also need to push the limits of human endurance.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And, all this talk about submarines and stealth and potential conflict, it kind of raises some ethical questions, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Anytime you have powerful technology like this, there's always the potential for misuse.
Right.
So it's important to have safeguards in place.
Yeah.
International agreements, rules of engagement, things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that worries me is just the lack of transparency. These submarines, they're operating in secret.
Yeah.
Nobody really knows what they're up to.
That's right.
And that can lead to a lot of mistrust and suspicion.
It can, and it can make it very difficult to prevent misunderstandings or even accidental escalation.
Right, because if you don't know what the other guy is doing, you tend to assume the worst.
Exactly. And that's
Yeah.
why communication is so important. Countries need to be open about their submarine capabilities.
Right.
They need to be clear about their intentions.
Uh-huh.
They need to be willing to engage in dialogue.
Yeah, so this isn't just about submarines and technology. It's about diplomacy and trust.
It is. It's about building relationships and finding ways to cooperate even in a competitive environment.
So to bring this all back to our listeners, what's the big takeaway here? What should we be thinking about?
Well, I think the most important thing is to recognize that the underwater world is becoming increasingly important.
Mm-hmm.
It's no longer some distant realm that we don't have to worry about.
Right.
It has
Mm-mm.
real-world implications for all of us. It affects trade, energy, security, international relations, you name it.
And as technology advances, those implications are only going to grow.
That's right.
Yeah.
So we need to be paying attention to what's happening beneath the surface.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be informed. We need to be engaged.
Well said. Well said. This has been a fascinating deep dive. I have learned a lot.
too.
And I'm sure our listeners have as well. So thanks for joining us today. And we'll see you next time for another deep dive into the world around us.